to be very interesting.
So,
And we're on 7.
do you want to do the welcome for
Sure.
Fernando Audubon, and then I can
Sure.
talk about
Yes.
how I met Amy. So,
Okay, good. I'm just saying welcome to everyone. I don't have everybody's face on. I'll do the other screen, gallery screen. So I'm going to say hello to everyone. President of on behalf of San Fernando Valley Audubon, I'm President Paula Orlovich, and I'd like to welcome you all here today. I think this is a really wonderful program we have today. Thank you to Richard Davis. And I think, I know a lot of people don't have their faces on and only their names, but perhaps many of you are going to be participating in the Christmas bird count. And so to me, this kind of really fits right in because we're looking at the birds and we're tracking them. And it's all about science and data and what it really gives us, the information it gives us. So I want to thank Richard for lining this up in this way. I'm really excited to hear about Amy's presentation today, and I'll let him go ahead and do the introductions. Thank you.
so welcome, Amy. I really appreciate you contributing your time. I got interested in this MODIS system because we were looking up at Mono Lake, and Mono Lake has the Mono Lake Conservancy, I guess, has a program where they were starting to install some MODIS towers. And I said, what the heck are MODIS towers? And the more I found out, the more excited I got. And it's a huge international collaboration, and it's very young. I mean, I don't know, Amy, you can maybe tell us when the first ones went up, but you know, there are little segments of the country, states or communities, their Audubon Society decides that this is an important project or there's an important piece of science to be done in their community, and they go out and support a newest set of towers. And everyone I've heard from the community, the research community, is one, young, and really chuffed, I guess is what we say these days about it. It's very exciting, and like all modern technology, it's evolving in place. There are some things that are 2 or 3 years old that are now ancient history. We got better technology going, and so there's some really exciting science and some really exciting biology and technology, and it's very impressive. So I said, well, I could get all excited and do a lot of research about this and find out a lot about what was going on. And I thought, well, maybe I just call up MODIS. So I called up MODIS in Canada, someplace, I don't know. And I said, I need somebody who can talk about what's going on, why it's important, what, you know, all sorts of research. I couldn't possibly learn all the research that's going on. And they said, well, Amy's your girl, so go for it. And Amy has been very accommodating, and she'll tell you more about her position in the overall program. But I think this is really great science, and it's really good for Audubon Conservancy goals. So without blathering on too much further here, I'd like to welcome Amy, and she's speaking to us from Vancouver, where she heads up, I guess, the Western, well, I don't know, you tell us what you head up there. And I've made you co-host, so go ahead and share your screen at any time you want, and tell us all about it.
All right. Okay. Are you seeing my?
I'm seeing your PowerPoint, and all you have to do, there you go. You're on.
Okay, you're seeing the title slide and not my notes.
Not yet.
Okay, perfect. All right. Well, yeah, thank you so much for inviting me to speak, and thanks for making this happen, Richard. I'm excited to talk to you all tonight. As Richard mentioned, I'm Amy, and I'm work for Birds Canada as one of the MODIS coordinators. So MODIS is an international collaborative endeavor to track the movements of small flying animals. Mostly this is bird migration, but there is also some work being done on bats and even some large insects like darners and monarch butterflies. MODIS is Latin for movement, and the MODIS Wildlife Tracking System is a program of Birds Canada, and we're a nonprofit for bird conservation. Our headquarters are in Ontario, and I think that Richard, you connected probably with Josh, who is based out of there as one of the Ontario MODIS coordinators. And then he directed you over to me since I am the coordinator for Western Canada. And MODIS was developed in partnership with Acadia University in Nova Scotia, and then also with the support of many, many other partners. I'm fairly new to the MODIS coordinator position in BC, so I just started here in the spring, but I'm coming to you from Vancouver, as mentioned, where I'm on the traditional territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations. So the conservation of migratory species is extremely challenging because it requires considering the threats that animals face that occur at different stages of their life cycle, and that typically span multiple jurisdictions, many habitats, and different landscapes that are often thousands of kilometers apart. So in order to enact effective conservation measures for migratory birds, we must first unlock where bottlenecks occur, where populations are threatened, and then prioritize where and when conservation actions might have the greatest impact. So I'm going to use the red knot as an example. They've experienced large declines in the late 90s and early 2000s due to the overharvesting of horseshoe crabs in Delaware Bay. And red knots feed on horseshoe crab eggs during spring migration as they stop over in Delaware Bay. But because of this overharvest of horseshoe crabs, red knots couldn't gain enough fat during stopover to fuel their migration to the Arctic and their breeding grounds. The horseshoe crab fishery is more strictly regulated now, but red knot populations haven't really recovered. So what's preventing that recovery? Is it still in Delaware Bay, or is it somewhere else in their annual cycle between their breeding grounds in Arctic Canada all the way down to their non-breeding grounds at the tip of South America? So understanding the full annual cycle of species and how all the seasons and places are linked is very important for effective conservation, but it's really challenging for migratory species. Tracking technologies are one tool that can give us a lot of insight into an animal's life cycle. There are many different types of tracking technologies, and the important thing to remember is that they're all complementary. There's not really a one-size-fits-all solution. It really depends on your research question, which one you might decide to use. I'll give you a few examples. We've got a geolocator on the blackpoll warbler here. You can see the geolocator right here. And these geolocators will give you a full year of data, and they'll give you a rough location or position of the bird based on the day length when the sun rises and sets. But you have to recapture the bird to get the device back to get the data. So that's tricky. There's traditional banding, which is very inexpensive. It's also fairly non-invasive, but the recapture rate is pretty low. Leg flags have a little bit higher of a recite rate because you don't have to physically recapture the bird. You can recite it with the scope. GPS tags in the bottom left here, they're very precise, but often they can only take a limited number of points to store on the device, and the smaller ones, again, need to be recaptured. Satellite tags, like on this Jaeger, are great, but they're really expensive, and the technology isn't really there yet to make them small enough for a lot of the smaller species of birds. And then we have radio telemetry. And radio telemetry tags are smaller, but the catch is that a bird has to pass close enough to a receiver to get detected. So how much data you get depends on how much receiver coverage you have. So MODIS uses radio telemetry, And the MODIS Wildlife Tracking System is an international collaborative research network that uses coordinated automated radio telemetry to facilitate research and education on the ecology and the conservation of migratory animals. Radio telemetry has been used to track animals since the 1960s, and the fundamental concepts of radio telemetry and tracking animals haven't changed much since then, but the technology has developed quite a lot. Essentially, how it works is a transmitter emits a signal at a specific frequency, and then that's picked up by an antenna connected to a receiver that's monitoring at that frequency. And these receivers can be located somewhere fixed, like a fixed receiving station, or they can be mobile. This is a receiver in a vehicle, and it probably has antennas on the roof of the vehicle, so they can drive around tracking animals. Traditionally, transmitters would each operate at a different frequency so that they were individually identifiable, and the receiver would cycle through that range of frequencies, monitoring for those transmitting tags. Now, MODIS is radio telemetry with a twist. So the philosophy behind MODIS is that we can harness the collective power of many individual research projects into one big coordinated effort that can expand the scale and the impact of everyone's work while making the most of limited research funding for conservation. So basically, we should all be working together. And so with MODIS, instead of having transmitters all operating on different frequencies, the transmitters are all on the same frequency, but they can still be identified individually because they're digitally encoded with a unique ID. And then all of the receiver stations are continuously monitoring for these transmitters. So that's kind of the key concept of MODIS, is that instead of having the tags you put out only being picked up by the receivers you're operating, we have all the tags on the same frequency so that all receivers everywhere are scanning for that frequency. And so anyone's receiver can pick up anyone's tag. So even if you're tagging birds just in your local area, once they leave that area, they could be picked up on someone else's receiver because it's monitoring at that same frequency. So you have more potential to get more detections and further away. Ideally, the system should grow and develop cooperatively so that we can all benefit. And most importantly, we can all work collaboratively on our research so that it benefits conservation efforts as much as possible. So while researchers can still work on their own individual projects using MODIS, and many do, MODIS is comprised of a lot of different projects, the projects can also be leveraged collectively to gain more knowledge about the threats that migratory species face. So what are the advantages of using radio telemetry? Radio telemetry has the smallest available transmitting devices, or so, other than like a bird band, but those aren't transmitting. So they can weigh as little as less than 0.2 of a gram, and they can be either battery or solar powered. They offer very high temporal precision. So when a bird is detected, you know it was there down to the second. This can be really helpful when you're studying something like departure timing. When do birds leave a stopover site on migration, and under what weather conditions? Like, are they using favorable tailwinds? That sort of thing. You also don't need to recapture the bird to get the data back. The detections are stored on the receiver, not the transmitter, unlike some devices like geolocators. So that can really increase your sample size and you can get a lot of data back. MODIS is radio telemetry, but it's collaborative and it's automated. So what do I mean by that? It's automated because the receivers are continuously monitoring for the transmitters. It's not only when you go out with a handheld antenna and scan for them, although you can certainly do that to supplement your data, but they're listening for all tags at all times, independent of you being there. And it's collaborative because Birds Canada houses all of the data for any of the projects that are participating in MODIS. So all the data is integrated in a central MODIS database, and that facilitates collaboration among users, and it means that we can make visualizations of the data available to the public on the MODIS website. So I'm going to take a closer look at the key components of the system, the animals that get tagged and the receivers that detect them. So for radio transmitters, there are a few different types. As I mentioned, there are both solar and battery powered tags. The battery powered tags, like this white one here and this one in the bottom left, the technology has gotten so that they can be extremely small, weighing less than 0.2 grams, but the smaller the battery, the shorter the battery life. So the absolute smallest ones last maybe a few weeks. With a bigger battery, the tags can last a lot longer. So depending on how large of a tag it's safe for the bird to carry, you could have a slightly larger tag that's going to last quite a bit longer. Some of them will even last over a year. The solar tags are quite new. One type doesn't have a battery at all. That's this one in the top left. So it's quite light as well, about 0.4 grams. But because it doesn't have a battery, it's only transmitting during daylight hours. Whereas this other solar tag does have a battery, and these tiny little solar cells recharge that battery so that it can keep operating continuously. But because it has a battery, it's a bit heavier, so it's about 1.5 grams. So a lot of birds are too small to carry that right now. So this is a red knot here just being released after tagging, and you can see if you look closely the antenna coming out the back over the tail. So that's the antenna on the transmitter, and that'll emit a pulse every few seconds that will be picked up by a receiving station if the bird is in the area of one. So then there are the receiver stations that detect the tagged animals. And as you can see, they come in all kinds of forms, in all kinds of places and habitats, from a mini station with just little antennas in the hills of Montana to stations attached to fire towers and buildings in Pennsylvania, to coastal New Brunswick, to the roof of an office building in urban Ottawa. So you can get a MODIS tower set up in many different kinds of spots. It's all a bit customizable and just takes a little creativity to figure out the best way to install one. So with the right tools and some creativity, you don't need to be a specialist or anything to put one up. It's anyone can learn to put up a MODIS station, and most researchers who use MODIS do put their own stations up, such as these folks got really creative and used a tree trunk to create a MODIS station in the Andes in Colombia. But sometimes we will enlist some help for some of the trickier ones. So the city of Surrey here in British Columbia helped us out with this one. And they helped us with their bucket truck to get the antennas up on top of one of their pump houses. So that was a really neat station that we set up. So basically what you need is some antennas that you can elevate and fasten them securely to a mast or a structure, and then connect those antennas via cables to the computer part of the receiver. And however you choose to get those antennas up high, any way you can think of can probably work. So there are two different types of receiver computer, the sensor station and the sensor gnome. And they work pretty similarly, they just have different makers. They can be connected to the internet or the cell network so that data transfers automatically back to Birds Canada's MODIS database. But if there's no wireless or cell coverage at the site, that's fine too. You can just come and download the data manually yourself and then upload it to the MODIS website later. So they're pretty flexible. And they're also open source software. So if someone was interested in building their own and tinkering with it to try and make improvements or develop new features, they could do that. Receiver stations can operate on solar power or standard power supply. If you've got a nearby outlet, you can just plug it in. This one here is on a wetland viewing platform, and it's got a solar panel hooked up on the side there. The range that the antennas can detect tagged animals at, they can detect them up to 10 miles or so away. It really depends on the landscape and what's in the line of sight, how far the range is. But if you've got a clear line of sight and you can get your antennas nice and high up, you can detect a tag from pretty far away, like at this station in the Montana hills that has a beautiful view. So this is a map of all of the receiver stations. So you can see that it's really an international network at this point. I checked earlier today just to see where we were at, and we have almost 1,000 stations up at this point. And the coverage isn't particularly even. It's definitely mostly in Eastern North America where the MODIS system started, but it's growing in South America. There's a pretty good network in parts of Europe and even a few towers coming up in Australia now. And it's also been expanding west in North America as well and growing out here on the West Coast. So what you have when you put all these tagged animals together with the array of receivers is the data that are recorded by receiver stations reveal animal movement across the landscape. So I've got an example here of semi-palmated sandpipers and white rump sandpipers that were tagged in southwestern James Bay in Northern Ontario. And what you can see is that the semi-palmated sandpipers in green moved out to the east coast of the US and Canada, as did the white rump sandpipers, but the semi-palmated sandpipers tended to move a little further north along the east coast than the white rumps, and a lot of them went to the Bay of Fundy, which is a major stopover site for semi-palmated sandpipers. But it's not quite as simple as transmitters plus receivers. An international collaborative network requires a huge amount of infrastructure support and behind the scenes maintenance to keep it all running. So this is how it all fits together, more or less. We've got the animals with tracking devices on them, and then they are picked up by the receiving stations, and then that data goes into the central MODIS database. And then the users who are tagging the animals are also contributing data to the database, saying what animals they put tags on, what stations they set up where, how many antennas those stations have, that sort of thing. That data all gets amalgamated. And then the users can go back and download their data and use it for their projects, analyze it, and hopefully work towards it providing useful information that will inform conservation action. At the same time, the data is also summarized and presented on the MODIS website so that folks can go and look at it, see some tracks of animals where receiving stations are in their area. And then we're also working on getting some of this data transferred over to some other data portals and online tools like MoveBank, which has a database of animal tracking and movement that includes a lot more than just birds. So there's a whole kind of system that takes a lot of different parts and puts it all together to make MODIS work. So this is just a quick snapshot of the state of the system at the moment. So I took this week to see where we're at. And so as of this week, we've got 31 countries on 4 continents that have MODIS stations, almost 1,000 stations in total. And over 25,000 animals have been tagged of over 200 different species. Almost 350 projects are working with MODIS, and those projects are being run by almost 900 partners and collaborators who are tagging birds, operating stations, that sort of thing. And then all of this has yielded at this point over 100 publications, and hopefully more to come. So now I thought I would highlight a few of the incredible studies that some of the MODIS collaborators have been doing over the last few years. There's been some really amazing research that folks have been doing, so I just want to highlight a little bit of that here. So this first one I'll mention is a study led by Ali Anderson, which she did for her PhD work, again in James Bay in Northern Ontario, on shorebirds. And so James Bay is a really important stopover site for many species of shorebirds during their southbound migration. And the James Bay Shorebird Project maintained 8 MODIS stations along the James Bay coast. And then there were also the many stations south of James Bay maintained by various other MODIS users and collaborators. So the field crews captured shorebirds using mist nets at 3 remote field camps along the southwestern James Bay coast, and deployed radio transmitters on 6 different species: white rump sandpiper, semi-palmated sandpiper, least sandpiper, pectoral sandpiper, semi-palmated plover, and lesser yellowlegs. And the tags, which you can see here in this photo of the lesser yellowlegs, are glued on the rump just above the tail so that the antenna extends out over the tail. And that way, when the bird molts, undergoes its next molt, the tag will come off and it's not stuck carrying a tag with a dead battery that's no longer transmitting. So what Ali found was that birds that were able to put on more fat before they left James Bay made fewer stops in other parts of North America. So here in this figure in the bottom left, we've got a panel for adults and juveniles, because she looked at those separately. And then along the x-axis on the bottom, we've got relative departure fuel load, which is essentially a measure of how much fat the bird is putting on before it leaves on migration. And then on the y-axis, we've got the probability of that bird making another stop in North America south of James Bay. And what you can see is that when the bird didn't have a lot of fat, they had a higher probability of making another stop. But when the bird did put on a lot of fat in James Bay, it was less likely to make another stop in North America. And this was true for both adults and juveniles. So shorebirds are capable of making some truly impressive long distance flights. And this is on the right here is an example of a semi-palmated sandpiper that was tagged in James Bay. And the points are detections on MODIS stations, and then the red star is where it was tagged. So what you can see is that based on the time elapsed between detections, it appears that this bird flew nonstop from James Bay down to the north coast of South America, where it was then detected on another MODIS tower there. So it's amazing how they'll double their weight putting on fat during stopover, and then they'll just burn it all and arrive extremely skinny after a multi-day nonstop flight of thousands of kilometers. Ali also found that birds that put on more fat during stopover in James Bay were more likely to be detected again on MODIS stations south of James Bay. So again, we've got the amount of fat they're putting on the x-axis here, and then the probability of them being detected on another MODIS station south of James Bay on the y-axis. So birds that put on a lot of fat had a higher probability of being detected again. And this might suggest that birds that were in better body condition with more fuel stores were more likely to survive migration, which is a really energetically expensive task. And then Ali also looked at whether different species behave differently or showed different migration strategies based on their total migration distance. So in shorebird terms, least sandpiper and semi-palmated plover are relatively short distance migrants, spending the non-breeding season in the southern US and the Caribbean. So traveling about 4,000 to 5,000 kilometers south of James Bay. Short distance, I know, for shorebirds. Semi-palmated sandpiper and lesser yellowlegs are more medium distance migrants that travel up to 7,500 kilometers south of James Bay to their non-breeding grounds. And then white-rumped sandpiper and pectoral sandpiper are long distance migrants that travel up to 11,000 kilometers south of James Bay to their non-breeding grounds in southern South America. So species that had a longer total migration, like white-rumped sandpiper and pectoral sandpiper, spent a longer time during stopover in James Bay than shorter distance migrants. So they might have spent 3 weeks stopping over in James Bay, whereas the shorter distance migrants spent only about 2. And the longer distance migrants also put on more fat before they left James Bay. So the white-rumped sandpiper here had a greater amount of fat at departure time from James Bay than a semi-palmated plover, which was migrating a shorter distance, did. So Ali was able to combine MODIS data with body condition data measured when the bird was captured for tagging to find out some really interesting information about how birds migrate. So now I'll switch gears a little bit and talk about some really amazing research done on thrushes on northbound migration by Dr. Camila Gomez and Dr. Ana Gonzalez, who are researchers with the Colombian NGO Selva, and Ana is also a postdoc with Environment and Climate Change Canada. So I'll start with Camila Gomez's study that she led on gray-cheeked thrush migration. And so they looked at thrushes migrating north from a stopover site in northern Colombia. And using MODIS, they found that these thrushes were making up to 3,000 kilometer flights from this one site in Colombia. And also that those birds that were able to put on more fat at the stopover site in Colombia were able to fly faster and arrive more quickly in North America. So in this graph, we've got, once again, the amount of fat they're putting on the x-axis, and then here we have the days in between intercontinental detections on MODIS stations. So the amount of days in between being detected at their departure on the MODIS station in Northern Colombia, and then being detected making an intercontinental flight to North America. So we can see that birds that had more fat took fewer days to get from Colombia to North America, only a couple of days between those intercontinental detections, whereas birds that had less fat took a longer time to get there. So this research shows how important this stopover site in Colombia is for these birds. It's fueling these 3,000 kilometer flights. And so protecting habitat like this is essential for conserving migratory species. So Ana Gonzalez studied Swainson's thrushes on their wintering grounds in Colombia and compared the migration of birds that wintered in native forest versus those that wintered in shade-grown coffee plantations. And the common thinking was that birds that wintered in high quality habitats would be able to leave on migration earlier and therefore arrive on the breeding grounds earlier and have higher reproductive success. But until recently, it was difficult to really test this because we didn't have the technology to track small birds. But now with MODIS, we can use the MODIS system to track small birds at these kind of continental scales. So Anna and her team were able to assess habitat quality, and they found that the native forests were generally higher quality than the shade-grown coffee, but that the thrushes that wintered in the native forest actually left later, not earlier, as was expected. However, the thrushes that were leaving later from these higher quality habitats were able to migrate faster. So they were essentially able to catch up with the early migrants. So that's showing that there's more than one strategy for successful migration. So studies like this show how habitat quality on the wintering grounds can be linked to things like arrival time on the breeding grounds thousands of kilometers away, and show us how important it is to consider the how strongly linked the different parts of the annual cycle of a bird's life history is. So that's some really cool research that's been done by these great researchers coming up with really interesting and innovative projects and ways to use MODIS data. I thought I'd mention just quickly a new project that we've just started.
Amy, could I interrupt briefly?
Oh yeah, for sure.
I meant to introduce you. I left out 2 key announcements. And everyone has been very good about keeping themselves muted. And so I congratulate them on doing that, even without me saying anything. But the other thing that we normally do is if you have questions, please submit them on the chat and we will compile those questions for you at the end of the talk. So we have some old timers who are already doing that, but I wanted to make sure everyone was aware that they can submit questions right now, and we'll try to get them all ready for Amy at the end of her talk. So I'll go back and let you have the floor again.
Awesome, thanks for that.
Okay.
Yeah, please feel free to ask me any questions that you may have. So we just started a new project here in British Columbia studying the overwintering movements of dunlin in the Fraser River estuary. So we've been adding a few new MODIS stations to the existing ones that are currently here. Those are in green on this map, and then we've got a couple more we want to add within the next few months, up to a year or so, hoping to get these 2 new stations in. So that we have a really nice network along the coast. And we're tagging dunlin in both Boundary Bay here and then also on Roberts Bank, which is over here along the outer coast. And we want to see how much do dunlin move between Roberts Bank and Boundary Bay. What sort of frequency do they move around the estuary at as they spend the winter here? It's really close to Vancouver, so it's quite an urban area, and there may be more development in the area. So we want to understand how dunlin depend on the different habitats and how much they move around, what sites they rely on, so that we can better advocate for protecting more habitat in the estuary. And we're also working on integrating some new technologies to expand the possibilities of what MODIS can do. So the solar tags that I talked about earlier are a recent addition, and they're through a collaboration with Cellular Tracking Technologies, which is a wildlife tracking company. So these tags are the ones that don't have a battery. So they're quite light, and they work indefinitely because they're solar powered. But they do operate at a different frequency than the battery-powered nano tags that we've been using for a few years with MODIS. So we still want to maintain that advantage of MODIS, where the bird's U-tag can be picked up on all of the other researcher stations. So what we're working on is having all new stations operate at both frequencies, what we're calling dual mode stations, so that they can pick up both types of tags. So right now that means adding 2 different types of antennas, one for the battery powered tags that operate at 166 megahertz, and then one type of antenna for the solar powered tags that operate at 434 megahertz. And so all the new stations we are putting up will be dual mode, and we're also trying to upgrade some of the old stations to dual mode as well when we have the chance. And so we're putting out the battery powered 166 megahertz tags on the dunlin in the Fraser estuary, but we're also putting out the 434 antennas on our stations in the Fraser Estuary so that they can pick up other researchers' tags that they deploy. Even though we're not deploying any, we know that there are some collaborators in northwestern Mexico who are tagging shorebirds or planning to tag shorebirds there, and they're going to be using the solar tags. So we want to make sure that the towers we set up will also be able to detect their birds so that they'll be able to get that extra information if the birds come through our area as they're migrating north. Another exciting new technology that is coming from cellular tracking technologies is what's called nodes. So these are essentially mini receivers that can be arranged in a grid with each one maybe a few hundred meters apart, kind of the white asterisks on these images here. And then they pick up the tags on these little antennas that they have, and then they'll also transmit that back to a traditional MODIS station as a base. And then the MODIS station will transmit that all back to the MODIS database. So this will allow researchers to look at much finer scale movement than just traditional MODIS towers have allowed, because they have such a large detection range. These ones have a shorter detection range, but because they can be placed so close together in larger numbers, they will allow you to get a much finer scale picture of how the birds are moving around. So this image is just showing where a bird is spending most of its time. It's spending most time in the redder areas, and then the smaller amounts of time further to the outside of these movement blobs, I'll call them. And then as the technology that MODIS uses has expanded, so has the array of receiver stations. As I mentioned, we're up to almost 1,000 stations, but here's the array of MODIS stations just 6 years ago. And you can see that it's largely limited to the East Coast and Southern Ontario, which is where MODIS started, with Acadia University in Nova Scotia, and then Bird Studies, or Birds Canada's headquarters in Southern Ontario. So how has it gotten to this worldwide collaboration in just 6 years? In part, it's due to more independent projects joining MODIS and putting up their own receivers, and then organically that grows the network. But in large part, it's also due to the efforts of regional collaborations. So a number of regional collaborations have developed within MODIS, and one of the earlier regional collaborations was the Northeast MODIS collaboration, led by Lisa Kijuk at Willistown Conservation Trust and other collaborators. And in early 2017, which is what you see in this map here, they noticed that there really were not very many stations in the interior Northeast states like Pennsylvania, and they wanted to fill that gap. So they put up many stations over the next 3 years, all these red points you see on this map here. And so they added 20 stations in Pennsylvania in 2017, and then another 12 stations. And then in 2019, 18 more stations, including expanding into Maryland and Delaware. So they've done a lot of great work to get really good coverage across Pennsylvania. And one of the techniques that they used was putting antennas up on fire towers, which was a really great idea, because then you get the antennas up high and you're building on a structure that's already there. So they've had a lot of success with that, which is really neat. One of the newer collaborations is the Midwest Migration Network Telemetry Working Group, and that's led by Sarah Kendrick with the Missouri Department of Conservation. And so they've got a really ambitious plan for receivers. All these orange dots are proposed stations or ideas of where they could put stations. So they've adopted a strategy, which we're calling the receiver fence strategy, where essentially you're putting up stations in horizontal lines across states, so that you can capture north-south movements. And then they're also interested in putting up stations along the lake shores and along the Mississippi. So they've got some really exciting plans to get a lot more coverage in the Midwest, which up until now hasn't had a lot of MODIS stations yet. And then moving west, we've got the Great Plains Chihuahuan Desert MODIS group, which is led by Matt Webb at Bird Conservancy of the Rockies. And they are particularly interested in using MODIS to study grassland birds, which are in steep decline. So they've got plans for a couple of receiver fences through Kansas and Colorado. And then they also want to get a number of stations at grassland conservation sites in the Chihuahuan Desert in northern Mexico. And then up in Montana and Idaho, we've got the Intermountain West collaboration, which is being led by William Blake at MPG Ranch. And they've been making some amazing progress getting stations up there, and they've been doing some really interesting work on Lewis's woodpecker as well with MODIS. And then finally, here on the West Coast, where I think most of us are, we've got the Partners in Flight Western Working Group MODIS initiative, and Mary Whitfield at the Southern Sierra Research Station is spearheading this initiative. And I think she might be presenting to this group about their tricolored blackbird MODIS project sometime in the new year. So as you can see, we've got a very ambitious amount of ground to cover, basically the entire Pacific Flyway. And this map is from 2017 on the left here. And what you can see is there were very few MODIS stations, just a bit of a cluster in southern British Columbia. But we're growing a lot, and there are a lot more now in Idaho, some's coming up in Colorado, in Montana, and a few coming online in California now too as well. We've got ambitious plans again for the next couple of years. These blue points on the right here are tentative plans for where we would like to have MODIS stations up within the next couple of years. Initially, that was planned for 2021, but I think we've been delayed a bit by the pandemic, as pretty much everyone has. So we're really working to get more coverage in the Pacific Flyway, so that we have kind of similar density, or at least getting close to what they have in the eastern part of North America. So our goal at MODIS is to be an example of the power of collaboration, essentially. Birds Canada might be the headquarters or where the database is stored, but we really couldn't do any of this without all the efforts of these regional collaborations and the folks championing MODIS on the ground in their home areas. That's really what makes MODIS work, is the power of champions for it coming together. So I'll leave you with a final example of collaboration, and that's how many researchers using MODIS for their independent projects can also pool their data to get more information to create a new study. And that's something we're trying to do more and more of now and in the future as MODIS develops, is leveraging this huge amount of data we've collected to address big questions or large scale studies, and hopefully provide information that can be useful for conservation. So this was a project that combined data from 13 different MODIS projects, studying shorebirds independently, but they put all of their detections together for red knots, ruddy turnstone, sanderling, and semi-palmated sandpiper. And Sjoerd Douwens, who's a postdoc at Environment Canada at the time, led the analysis looking at migration speed. So what they found was that all of the species, red knot, ruddy turnstone, sanderling, and semi-palmated sandpiper, all migrated faster in spring than they did in fall. So we've got pre-breeding here on the left, and then on the right, post-breeding migration. So faster migration speeds overall in spring. And birds made longer stopovers on fall migration. They spent longer when they stopped than they did in the spring. However, when Sherd looked at airspeed or actual flight speed, they actually flew faster in the fall than they did in the spring. So they made longer stops in the fall, so the overall pace of migration was slower, which is why we saw a higher pace of migration in the spring. But when they were actually flying, they were flying faster than they did in spring. So this could be for a few reasons. It's possible that in the spring they used an energy minimizing strategy so that they didn't fly as fast as they could so that they'd save some energy for breeding, which is pretty energetically costly. But it also could be that they flew faster in the fall to avoid predators. So there's a raptor wave of migration that's a little later than a lot of the shorebird migration. And the higher flight speeds were seen earlier in the fall. So it's possible that they were flying south quickly to avoid predation by raptors. So this is just a cool example of what you can do when you have a big data set that spans the continent or the hemisphere, when you've got many projects using the same system so that the data can be combined to get more out of it. And at its heart, MODIS is about community science. So it's a global network of researchers and volunteers and practitioners who all contribute various parts to the system, and they're all working together even when sometimes they might not know they are. And we can generate fairly robust, fairly fine scale information about movement, flight speed, departure timing, all sorts of things. And it can be applied to a variety of research questions. And the parts are fairly affordable. It's certainly less expensive than something like satellite tracking. A lot of the parts for the towers can be sourced from a variety of places, and the cost in total usually ranges from about $2,000 on the lower end to, if you want to go full out and get every kind of bell and whistle, maybe $10,000. It's Canadian, so I'm not quite sure what that translates to American, a little bit less. And also MODIS provides educational opportunities. It's certainly been a part of many university students' theses, but MODIS also has an education platform for grades 7 to 12 as well, where we've developed a number of case studies of species that have been studied using MODIS, and then there's a little curriculum linked package that students can work through to learn about migration and conservation. And a number of schools actually have MODIS stations on them. So that's a really neat opportunity for students to connect directly with the birds that are flying through their area, because they can go and look at exactly what birds have been detected on the tower at their school. And ultimately, we hope that MODIS, data collected using MODIS can be used for conservation, and that overall MODIS is greater than the sum of its parts. So by combining all the efforts of these various research projects, they can operate individually, but also collectively to get as much benefit as possible out of the effort. So with that, I will be happy to take questions. This is just a few of the partners and collaborators on MODIS. There's certainly more than I could possibly fit or name on this slide. But thanks again for having me. And I would be more than happy to answer any questions.
Well, thank you very much. I really appreciate you putting all the work to gathering information from all over the network, and certainly I learned a lot during the time. Marianne has compiled the questions that have come in through your talk, so I'm going to restrain myself and let the other participants have their questions answered first. So Marianne, you want to go ahead?
Okay, yeah, Debbie James asked, how many days of flight does it take from James Bay to South America?
Yeah, that's a great question. Some species have been recorded making nonstop flights from James Bay to South America in 6 days. So it's really impressive that some may be shorter. That's the one I know of for sure. And it depends on the migration strategy. Shorebirds employ a strategy that where they make a few really long flights, whereas other species, some passerines, will employ a strategy where they make multiple or more short flights and more short stopovers, whereas shorebirds will make more a few really long flights and make a few longer stopovers. You may have heard about the bar-tailed godwit that was recently in the news, flying from Alaska to New Zealand in 11 days, I think.
Okay, great, thank you. All right, Muriel Croton asks, do you see any difference in, this is a very specific question, in the percentage of Swainson's thrush that arrived in North America between those that wintered in native habitat or shade coffee plantations?
I don't know. I'm sure Anna, who led that study, would know much better than me. What I know is that they found that the birds that wintered in native forest were able to migrate faster than the birds that wintered in the shade coffee plantations. So the birds that wintered in the native forest may have been able to make a longer, faster direct flight, and the birds that didn't may have made a number of shorter flights and therefore taken longer, but I'm not positive about that.
Okay. From Jolene, we have a question. How do you determine where to install the Motus towers? And I think you partially answered this. How many per year? How do you do your growth program?
Yeah, how we determine where to install the towers is a few different factors. There's where is a good site in terms of the characteristics of the site. So is it open? Is it at a higher elevation, or does it have a building that we could get antennas up high on? If there's a power supply, that's really nice because it's a bit more reliable than solar. So looking for a site that offers good characteristics for having a good detection range and power supply, and where we can get permission from the landowner or that sort of thing definitely factors in. And then looking for places that are known migration corridors or stopover sites can be really, really good for that. I keep falling back on shorebird examples, but you may have figured out that that is what I focus a lot of my work on. But shorebirds, because they congregate often so densely at stopover sites, that can be a really valuable place to put a Motus station, because you're probably going to get a good number of detections. And how many we put up in a year really depends on funding. That's kind of what it comes down to.
Okay, all right, great. Let's see. Caroline Brenner asks, do the birds mind being tagged?
That is a good question too. I certainly don't think that they necessarily enjoy being captured and tagged. But it's when done by someone who's trained well and has a lot of experience, it can be done very quickly. So we really try to minimize handling time so that the birds are as stressed as little as possible. And we in order to tag birds, you need to have a banding permit, and then you need to get special authorization to put out transmitters, and the banding permits generally have very specific you know, authorizations as to what you can tag and what kind of tags you can put on the birds. And you have to demonstrate that you have enough experience to get that authorization. And you have to have animal care committee approval as well to get it.
Oh, boy. Okay. All right. Richard had a couple of questions. He was looking at a picture of the antennas, and there seem to be like two sets of antennas. Is that like pointing in different directions, or what was that all about?
Yeah, so the antennas, most of the antennas on MODIS stations are directional. So they put out a beam, essentially a detection beam, so you want to arrange the ways that you point your antennas in the direction that you think you're going to get the most detections. So if you're if you are looking to pick up birds that are maybe foraging out on a mudflat, you would want to aim your antennas out over that mudflat. And for those receiver fence strategies, often you'll put antennas back to back like that, parallel. So you have one pointing one way and then the other pointing 180 degrees. So you basically have a 10-mile detection range on either side going out that way.
Okay. And what does CTT stand for?
That's Cellular Tracking Technologies. It's the company that makes those solar powered tags with no battery and the little mini receiver nodes.
All right. Rose Leibowitz asks, how much does it cost to put an antenna up and service it? I see you thinking, Rose.
On the low end, couple $1,000 probably, and then on the high end, maybe 7,000. So the receiver, like the sensor gnome or the sensor station, the computer part of the receiver is 500 to 700 maybe, and then each antenna is maybe 300. So the more antennas you have, the more expensive it will be. And then the cables are not too expensive. And then there are a couple other parts that add a bit. If you have power supply that you can plug it into, that will save some money, because adding the solar panel and the battery and the solar controller would probably add about $500 to it. So low range 2,000, high range 7,000.
So you've got various package deals.
Yeah.
Okay. And the tags, how do you purchase those, or how do you
the tags are about $200 a tag, and the battery powered nano tags that we have been used with MODIS for years are through a company called Low-Tech Wireless, and they make a variety of wildlife tracking devices. And then Cellular Tracking Technologies makes those solar tags, and they're a similar price. They make some battery powered tags as well that are also compatible.
Okay, great. Jill Hoskins asks, how useful are MODIS receivers in cities? She lives in downtown LA, so.
I think that in cities, there certainly are a number of MODIS towers in cities. There's one at the Toronto Zoo. I think getting it on a tall building is probably a big benefit in a city, because you'd have a lot of obstruction from buildings if it wasn't high. The other thing with cities is that you're probably going to get a bit more radio interference than you do in a more remote location or a more rural location. So that is one thing. There can be radio noise from various other kind of machinery, equipment around that can kind of bleed into and get picked up by the antennas and create some noise in the data that could show up as false positives, but those can be dealt with when you're processing the data.
Okay. All right. So it can be cleaned up a bit.
Yeah.
Okay. And so Wanda asked, kind of follow on that. Do you use existing towers, such as towers for microwave, amateur radio, etc.? I was thinking of the Los Angeles Public Library, very tall tower. Maybe we can stick something on top of that.
I know that some people have, or some groups have been able to do some co-locations with like cell towers and that sort of thing, and then putting Modus antennas partway up those cell towers. I believe the Northeast Modus collaboration did some of that. So I don't know if there have been any instances where the antennas have been shared, because the antennas are monitoring at specific fairly narrow frequency ranges. So it would depend on having an antenna that was monitoring at the same frequency you needed. But certainly putting antennas up on other kind of communications towers has been done. And I know that a number of Modus users have reached out to kind of ham radio enthusiasts to kind of run ideas by and explore possibilities for the technology.
Okay. Paul Blyden asks, how does Modus determine if a location is usable to the program? I guess, what are the criteria?
I think that if it's a location that doesn't already have a nearby tower, that's great. And I think that, as I mentioned before, having a good line of sight is really important. Because if you don't have a good line of sight, that can really reduce the amount of detections you get. And then a lot of it really depends on having kind of a local boots on the ground who can help with getting permissions to put it up in that place and also maintain it. Because getting the tower up is one thing, but then there's always a bit of maintenance that kind of goes along with it. So having someone who can do that is really helpful.
Okay, great. Jill asks again, is Modus a collaborator with the Cornell Ornithology Lab?
Are we a formal collaborator with Cornell? There's certainly some Cornell affiliated projects that have used Modus, I believe. And one thing we are working on incorporating like eBird range maps into some of our public visualizations and ways we process the data. So that's one way. So I think
kind of, yes.
Yeah, kind of. It's not like I don't think it's a really strong formal partnership for a specific purpose, but they've intermingled.
Okay, all right, really great. All right, Debbie James asked, can Modus determine if a bird perishes in mid-flight?
Not definitively, probably. I think that because it depends on whether there is receiver coverage, a bird can only be detected if there are receivers in the area. So if you stop getting detections from that bird, it could be that they died, or it could be that it's just in an area without coverage. There's probably there are some analytical ways to get at kind of shorter term survival studies using Modus. I think there's been a bit of work done on post-fledging survival of juvenile swallows in southern Ontario. where they were able to model that. And so there's that, but I don't think it can definitively say, unless you had a mortality occur like directly near a tower, so that you had a moving bird being detected and then you had a detection just continuously from the same location over and over again, you would probably then that might give you an idea that something's happened. Although if the transmitter is on the ground, not moving, they do transmit a lot better when they're in the air. So that also might be a bit of a challenge.
Dave
Long-winded
Weezoff
answer,
asked-
sorry.
Okay. Dave Weezoff asked if the tags fall off during molt and are lost after a year. I had
Depends. It's for ones that are glued on, generally, yes, they will come off when the bird molts. So that's common with shorebirds, because shorebirds put on so much weight during stopover, they'll double their weight, so their mass is changing really dramatically. And harnesses can be tricky because you want it to fit really closely so that it's safe. But if the bird is changing its size so dramatically, then that's hard to fit a harness. But some of the passerines, it's more common to use leg loop harnesses, and they're often made out of stretchy material, and that does eventually wear out, but some of them may keep them on longer than a year.
All right, one last question. Have you guys noticed any difference since the pandemic started in birds being more successfully migrating or not?
That's a great question. I can't say if we've noticed anything or not. I don't think we've done enough kind of deeply digging into the data to be able to say. MODIS data does take quite a bit of processing to do that kind of analysis. Certainly there was less tagging happened this year because a lot of people couldn't get out and do field work because of the pandemic. But some still was able to go ahead safely. And for the most part, we didn't have too many stations down because of travel restrictions, but for sure in the spring, there was a lot more offline than usual.
Okay.
So if I can add on, knowing my own enthusiasm, I'm wanting to know, well, what can I do in my area? Are there ornithologists in Los Angeles, or where can I find out about groups, research groups that are wanting to use this technology? They need support either in the form of money to put up towers or buy tags, or they need people to come and help put them up, monitor them, guard them from people coming, and so on. What kind of volunteer efforts, and how would we find out about those?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I would say probably contacting, I think I'll talk to the other MODIS West coordinators and collaborators in the States, because I am not as familiar with California as they are, and see what some of the plans are in terms of expanding in California. And I know Mary Whitfield at Southern Sierra Research Station has some expansion plans, and I believe she's in Southern California. So she would be someone to talk to, and then I will also follow up about California expansion plans as well, and see what's in the works there, and then can get back in touch with you about possibilities for that.
All right, so we're recording this presentation. I hope you're all right with us putting it on our website for people who couldn't make it tonight.
Sure.
So that should be up in the next few days. And I'll restrain myself from getting into technical questions here. Yeah. Thank you again for an excellent talk, and I'm going to ask Paula to unmute herself if she would like to say a goodbye there, or anyone else.
Okay, so I want to thank everybody for attending and wish everybody Merry Christmas, Happy Holidays, a happy, healthy New Year. Let's all stay safe. If you're doing any birding, do it at a distance, wear your mask,
Right.
count those birdies up, share your data, and I'm looking forward to see what Richard finds out. Perhaps our chapter can get involved in this. It looks like something that's very interesting. Thank you all. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Show of hands.
All
Thank
right.
you, Amy.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you.
Very much.
Bye.
Night.
Good night.
Thank you. Bye.
Good night, Amy from Canada.
Night, everybody.
Well, I will. I just wanted to see people disappear. Sue John stayed on, but get their microphone down.
Thank you. That was wonderful. I can't hear you.